Today on the Nathan Jacobs podcast, you feel that in the air? That's Christmas coming our way. What is that feeling really? We'll find out today on the Nathan Jacobs podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. So as the year is winding down, my efforts have been winding up in terms of the East-West series. If you haven't heard about it, it's a 25-part lecture series that I've been putting together that explores the differences between the Christian East and the Christian West, and it is available for pre-sale today. So if you want to support my efforts in putting that series together, go ahead and head over to theeastwestseries.com. That's theeastwestseries.com and order it at the lowest price it will ever be offered. Now, on today's episode, what we have for you today is a throwback episode, an episode that I suspect many of you did not actually see. And this is about this time of year, Christmas. So our episode today is actually on that sense that you feel in the air where you say, what is that? Well, it's Christmas. Christmas is coming. You can just feel it, right? There's something about this season. And the question that I explore in this episode is, what is that feeling? Why is it that it seems like the whole world begins to wake up as if anticipating something? Well, spoiler alert, the answer is it is anticipating something. As we prepare for Christmas, enjoy this throwback episode of the Nathan Jacobs podcast. Welcome back, everybody. Well, it is December. And had I not said it, you'd know it already just from the change in the weather, the change in the music you're hearing, in the decorations that are going up, all the Christmas shopping. Yes, that's right. Christmas is a-coming. And so in keeping with that, we wanted to give you a couple of holiday episodes here on the Nathan Jacobs podcast. But of course, in the unique sort of way that we would do it, which is to talk about philosophy and theology and things like that. So, around this time of year, people experience a host of feelings. And I think for that reason, you start to get a number of folks waxing eloquent, trying to unearth what it is that we all seem to experience, because it does seem to be something that is ubiquitous, right? Something in the air. We all begin to feel it. And when trying to diagnose that, a lot of times people will talk about nostalgia. Right. It's about an innocent time hearkening back to your childhood, or it's missing certain people from your past, or childhood memories, or deceased relatives, or whatever it may be. And I certainly think there's plenty of that this time of year does, in fact, occasion. I admit that I am as a child of the 80s and the 90s, I have a lot of fond memories of things like action figures. The Christmas for me as a child was marked by, would I get the sort of action? Am I going to get the G.I. Joes that I want, or the Star Wars action figures I want, or the He-Man action figures that I want, whatever it is? There was a lot of that sort of gift giving, nostalgia. Incidentally, if you never watched the Netflix series, The Toys That Made Us, I love that. Like, my childhood is all over that. So yeah, there's plenty of fond memories. And I also have fond memories of family gatherings. My family, which I have a lot of, cousins and aunts and uncles and all that, we always got together specifically on Christmas Eve. And that was one of the rare times where you would see that many people come together in our house. And I loved it. I loved all the sort of baking and the cooking that would happen, seeing the relatives come in, the buzz of the whole thing, getting to hang out with my cousin Phil. Hey, Phil, just in case you listen. I don't know if you do. But that just made my childhood and all the anticipation of it too. I remember that so fondly. So I grew up, I went to a Lutheran grade school, St. Peter's, and there was a Christmas pageant that happened every year. And it was funny because there was always, I think there were 3 slots. It was like the 4 o'clock pageant, and then the 6 o'clock pageant, and I guess it would be the 8 o'clock pageant if we're going in 2-hour increments. And it was funny because, cycling throughout our family, there were a variety of folks who would be in that, right? My cousin was in it. I was in it. When my siblings were younger, they were in it. And so you had to wait and see the schedule, like, because we can't eat and open presents until everybody's back from the pageant. So you're like gunning for people, like, hopefully we're all in the 4:00 or something like that. And I remember even also as a kid in my grade school, the anticipation, the excitement that there was so much prep for the Christmas pageant. The fact that you got to get pulled out of class to go to rehearsals and things like that, which he loved that, right? Like, oh man, I don't have to go to math class. I can actually go and sit in a rehearsal with my friends and, screw around during the day rather than go to school. There's lots of great memories of anticipation, of toys, of food, of family, of all those sorts of things. And I think there's definitely a layer of that rolls around during this time of year. But when I was a child, there was something else that I sensed. And as I got older, the sense of that became all the more clear, which was that it seemed that there was something in the air, as if creation itself was aware that we were at a special time of year, as if creation itself was waking up or groaning, to use St. Paul's words. That somehow the cosmos itself knew that there was something special about this time of year. Something special was stirring, was happening. And as I got older, and the sorts of things that were special to me about Christmas when I was a child, right? The anticipation of a certain toy or present, or, getting to hang out with my best friend, or certain, types of foods that you might indulge. As those things started to recede into the background, I had a clear sense of that other sort of cosmic yearning or longing that sat underneath that feeling, that awareness that it seems creation itself is aware that this is a special time of year. And I think that's actually exactly what's happening during this time of year, around Christmas. And that is the thing I want to talk about here today. So some time ago, I did an episode, an impromptu episode on nostalgia and longing. And I springboarded off of this quote from Daryl Dixon. And there was there were other elements in there that prompted that, which I talk about in that episode, which, we can link to below. But one of the questions that I raised was prompted by Daryl Dixon, and specifically the sort of spin-off of The Walking Dead that is focused on Daryl. And there's a line in one of the episodes where Daryl says that you can't miss something that you never had. And I began to explore that question of saying, is that true? Or is it not? And obviously in that, well, I shouldn't say it's obvious. In that episode, what I argued that it's true that you can't miss something that you've never had. But I don't think that nostalgia and the sort of thing that we oftentimes identify as missing something is always nostalgia. So I talked about the fact that in this episode, right, in this show about Daryl, part of what prompted that quote was that he was talking with another character, and both of them had, really sort of horrible childhoods. And so there was this sense that on the one hand, they would look at these picturesque representations of a certain idyllic experience of family and of belonging and of safety and of love. And they would have this sense of missing that, right, from the world before. But it didn't make any sense because they never experienced that in the world before. So how could they possibly miss it? And what I had argued is that it's not nostalgia. They don't miss it. And yet the experience is very real. It's just that it's an experience of longing. That is to say that you and I, we have a sense as creatures of what we are made to be. There's a sense of teleology, right? The sense of the certain ends that we are made to experience, the things we are made to be. And when we encounter certain pictures of those idyllic states, as we encounter certain pictures of those teleological ends, we begin to experience longing for this thing that we know is what ought to be. And sometimes that longing we mistake for nostalgia. We mistake it for something that we miss. And I think one of the things that happens during this time of year is that there is a great deal of longing in all of humanity, in all of creation. But because it's also layered with all sorts of childhood memories or, experiences from our past or certain things that really are nostalgic, I think that what begins to happen is sometimes we presume that all that we're experiencing is really nostalgia. But I think there's something deeper, something cosmic, something more universal that's underneath it all, which is this cosmic longing. So what is that? And why is that? And here today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer my sort of uniquely Eastern Orthodox perspective on what that is and why it is. Why is it that the entire cosmos around this time of the year begins to groan in a way that we can all feel, longing for, well, what? And that's the question. So this is something that St. Paul talks about. St. Paul talks about the idea that all of creation groans for the unveiling of the sons of God. And the question is what is that? Right? What is that? What is this longing or this groaning that St. Paul is talking about? Now, to understand what that is and why that is, why that groaning, what that groaning is and why it's there, I think we need to look at several things that I'm going to draw from the Eastern Church Fathers. The one is the nature end of man, right? What is the proper end of our existence? The second is the vision for what the proper order of creation is. What is the end or purpose of creation itself? Then the third is how those two things relate. And that will set the stage in turn for the significance of the fall of man and thus of the cosmos. And finally, all of that will lay the groundwork for understanding the incarnation itself and what's significant about this time of the year. So let's begin with the nature of man. Central to the Eastern patristic understanding of man is that we are icons of God, that we are made in the image of God. And that's, of course, taken from the book of Genesis. Now, the thing here that we find in the Eastern Church Fathers is that they identify something that's rather sort of interesting about the narrative in Genesis. That in Genesis, it talks about, let us make man in our own image and according to our own likeness. And yet then God goes on and makes man in his own image. The likeness is not repeated. And the reason the Church Fathers think this is important is because they think what this indicates is that man is made in the image of God. This refers to a variety of things. This refers to our spiritual nature. This refers to the fact that we have reason, that we have free will. And so in this sense, we are sort of small images of God. But likeness has to do with this active trait, the fact that God is not just, a nature, but he is a free and active nature, one who is just and merciful and loving, one who is immortal and incorruptible and all these sorts of things. And the idea is that the likeness is the active imitation of God, the active participation in God. And this goes to the heart of what they think it is, what our purpose as human beings really is, which is to partake of the divine nature. So this is something that St. Peter talks about, where he talks about we escape the corruption that has come upon the world through partaking of the divine nature. And this is what the Eastern Church Fathers call deification, theosis, right? The idea of becoming gods. And it's a rather sort of shocking doctrine. When you first encounter it, if you've never heard of it, I remember first reading about it in St. Athanasius in his treatise on the incarnation. And in that treatise, he says that the Son of God or the Word of God became man in order that man might become God. Shocking statement, but it's not unique to Athanasius. You find this in Basil, Caesarea, and the other fathers. And so the question is, what does that even mean? And here I think what we need to talk about in order to understand, grasp what St. Peter and then the Church Fathers also are talking about, we have to understand the distinction that you find in the Fathers, which they draw from the New Testament, between God's essence and God's energy. So this is a doctrine that we've talked about a variety of times in a variety of contexts on this show. You can see my interview with David Bradshaw, and then it's sort of also scattered throughout a number of different episodes and discussions that I've had. But the short version of this distinction is basically that the term energia, right, energies, is something that originates in Aristotle. So Aristotle, he introduces this term of energia because he's trying to come up with a way of articulating or expressing this sort of uniqueness of divine activity. Now, what is that uniqueness? That uniqueness is that it is perfect or it is complete activity. And here what you need to understand is that Aristotle had basically looked around the world and determined that, well, the nature of reality, all of reality is always mutating and shifting and changing. It's all contingent. It comes into being and it goes out of being. It's in perpetual flux. And Aristotle was convinced that the only way in which that was possible is if all of that instability, all that potentiality sat on top of something that was pure actuality, something that had existence in itself, that was sort of immutably there, right, unchangeably there and stable. And that something that sits underneath all of that instability, that stable foundation on which it all stands upon, is God. But this is where Aristotle's God, the primary trait of that God is that he does not change. He does not mutate, right? That's his main distinctive. Now, Aristotle extrapolates that into a host of other sort of divine attributes, but that's sort of the marker of it. And the reason that's significant is then because what Aristotle recognizes is that there are certain types of activity that are inherently mutative, inherently shifts from potentiality to actuality, inherently unstable in the very ways that reality itself is kind of unstable, percolating into, from potential to actual and going away again. So, for example, the activity of, say, building a house, right? That's an activity you can begin and sort of get halfway through and abandon, and it's incomplete. And that sort of activity that's subject to change and to degrees of completion and things like that, Aristotle thought, well, that's not really indicative of the activity of God. That's not what an immutable being would act like. His activity would have to be perfect and complete at every moment. Something more like when I look at you, right? If you look at someone, it's a complete act in that moment, right? You look at them, it doesn't go through stages where you might abandon it, right? In the moment of doing it, it's complete, right? And so Aristotle drew a distinction between kinesis on the one hand, which was this progressive, mutative, changeable, imperfect activity, and energia, right, which was this perfect, complete activity. Now, the thing is, for Aristotle, he ends up just suggesting that what God is he's pure energia, pure energy. But what happens is this distinction between an operative power, right, an energy, and the nature of the thing ends up becoming rather significant in the way that later Alexandrian Jews began to think and talk about divine activity as well.
The Christian East and the Christian West share the same creed, the same scriptures, and yet they are worlds apart. The differences run deeper than Mary or icons or liturgy, going to the very nature of God, the hope of salvation, and even what it means to be human. They use the same words, but their meanings could not be more different. As these two worlds collide in our contemporary culture, what's needed is a translator. I spent nearly 2 decades studying these two traditions, devoting myself to figures like Augustine, Aquinas, and the Reformers in the West, but finding myself crossing the threshold of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And now, I'm producing a 25-part lecture series to help bridge this gap, exploring the differences between Eastern and Western Christianity. Pre-order the series now at the lowest price that will ever be offered, or support my efforts by becoming a series producer at theeastwestseries.com. That's theeastwestseries.com.
So what we find is that term, energia, ends up being picked up by Alexandrian Jews, people like Philo of Alexandria. But in these figures, we find a couple of distinctions that don't appear in Aristotle. It's part of the development of the concept and of the term. The one is that people like Philo end up drawing a distinction between God's essence and his energies, or his nature and his energies. Now, Aristotle had drawn a distinction between the nature of the thing and the operative power. To be fire is one thing, and then to exude heating and lighting, to the activities of fire, right? Exuding light and exuding heat, those are energies or operations of fire. The nature of mind is one thing, but the activity or the energy of articulating the properties or nature of mind in speech or in analysis is another, right? Aristotle had those sorts of distinctions, but not with regard to God, because his God was just nothing but a pure principle of activity, a mover of the world. And so Aristotle just said, well, the nature of God is just energy. He just sort of perpetually moves things. That's what he does. He was essentially an energetic principle, a source of motion for the world. But what people like Philo recognized is that being a Jew, right, he believed, based on the Bible, based on the Old Testament, he believed that God actually is a person who freely expresses himself, a person who relates to us, a person who makes choices. And for that reason, Philo wanted to draw a distinction, which Aristotle didn't, with regard to God, which is that the nature of God is one thing. Yes, God is infinite, right? God is, unique in his nature, but that nature expresses itself freely. So yes, God is just, and yes, God is merciful, but those are activities, and he has choices to make about how to exercise mercy or how to exercise justice. He can work miracles, and that will tell you something about his power. But that is a choice that God also makes. And so Philo introduces something, and this is something I talked about in my recent free will episode, that a lot of the pagan philosophers didn't really necessarily think of God as free. They thought of him as a principle. They would even ascribe to him will, but it wasn't clear that the pagans believed that God had self-determination, right? Choice in this sense. They thought of him almost more like a first principle that just sort of radiates all things. Whereas the Jews and the Christians were the ones who thought of God as a person, someone who has free will. And so for that reason, somebody like Philo begins to draw a distinction between God's nature or his essence on the one hand, and then his energia, his free expression of that nature, his operative powers that express themselves in the operations or the energies of things like justice and mercy, creating the world, right? He doesn't just sort of inevitably radiate it the way the pagan deities do, the way a Neoplatonist, for example, might presume that God just sort of inevitably emanates the world. And so that was the first distinction, right? The essence energies distinction that suggests that God is free and freely expresses his nature. The second development that emerged with this distinction was also the idea that the energies may, in some cases, be communicable. So this is the sort of thing that you see. One of the favorite analogies for this is the relationship between iron and fire. And here, what you see is an example where iron, even though it's of a nature that's distinct from fire, if the iron is heated by fire, at some point, the communion with fire will be of such a kind that the operative powers, the energies that express the nature of fire, will take up residence in the iron. So you remove the iron from the fire, and now this iron exudes heating and lighting properties. Well, where did it get those? It got those from the fire. So those are the operative powers or the energies of fire. Now, in this way, they've been transferred, they've been communicated. And so the metal remains metal, right? The iron remains iron, but the operative powers or the energies of a foreign nature have taken up residence within it by means of its communion with it. This became really important to how, again, Alexandrian Jews and then the Christians started to think about certain spiritual realities. When they considered things like the saints or they considered demoniacs, what they started to see here is that there is genuine participation in or communion with a foreign nature. So when we look at a demoniac and we say, well, he seems to have a foreign, a knowledge that he shouldn't have, secret knowledge that he shouldn't have, or he knows certain languages that he shouldn't know, or he has superhuman strength, strength that goes beyond his natural human capacities, or whatever it might be. What you start to see is that on the one hand, you could, as sort of like a Western mechanical thinker, start to think, well, I think maybe there's just something extrinsic to him that's whispering to him, or maybe it's not really him moving the thing, it's really the demon moving the thing, but we think it's him moving the thing, and you offer a mechanical explanation. But the sort of explanation you find amongst the Alexandrian Jews is different. It's much more like this fire and metal sort of relationship, where the idea is that the demoniac is in communion with something that's not human, namely a demon. And in that communion, the operative powers or the energies of that foreign nature have somehow taken up residence within him. And so now this is sort of a synergistic act where it's actually like him. He is one agent, but he has this sort of foreign or operative power within him that he is synergistically or cooperatively using. We might think of it like a branding iron. So if we take our metal fire analogy, and rather than just talking about generic metal and fire, we make the metal into a branding iron, now we get a picture of what synergy is. And that's really what you're talking about. You're talking about a synergistic relationship in the case of the demoniac. So if I take my branding iron, I heat it in the fire to the point that it's glowing and it's burning, I carry it over to a cow and I brand the cow. The question is, who's burning the cow? Is it the fire or is it the metal? And the answer is it's both. The operative powers that burn the cow belong to the fire. Those are the energies of fire. And yet, what carries the operative powers, those energies over to the cow, is the metal. What determines the proximity is the metal. What determines the shape of the burn is the metal. So in this sense, what you have is you have a synergistic act. You have two things, fire and metal, participating in one act. So it's a synergistic act, synergos, right? That's what it refers to, these two energies in one activity, right? You have these two agents, fire and metal, whose activities are converging in a single act. And that's what they see happening amongst the Alexandrian Jews. That's how they started to look at spiritual realities. When you're talking about a demoniac, you're talking about synergy. You're talking about an agent who is being energized by foreign operative powers. And in being energized, right, his activities of, whatever it may be, secret knowledge or superhuman strength or whatever it is a synergistic act. Because on the one hand, he is using it, just like the metal is carrying the fire, the operative powers over to the cow, just like the metal is determining the proximity to the cow, just like it's determining the shape of it. But what it's using is an operative power from something else. So in the same way, the demoniac is actually active in the act. He's not just a puppet. He is a participant in the act and making genuine contributions to the character and the shape of the act. And yet the operative powers that he's using in the act are not his own, right? They belong to something else, a demon. And so in the same way, this is what they saw in the saints. So what you see is amongst the saints, you see the same sort of thing. The difference is the foreign operative power is not that of a demon. It's the energies of God. And so you started to see this sort of concept emerge as integral to how the Alexandrian Jews understood participation in spiritual realities. And this concept ends up being picked up and echoed in the New Testament. So St. Paul is very fond of this term, energia. He uses it all the time. He talks about, for example, it's not me that works, but God works in me. That's actually a mistranslation because it's not ergon, right? He's using the term energia. So it's like God who energizes me. He talks about how the same God who energizes me for ministry to the Gentiles energizes Peter for ministry to the Jews. He talks about, when he talks about the Thessalonians being co-workers with Christ, right? He's talking about a synergistic act, right? The language there is synergistic, and he uses the middle voice to make it ambiguous. Who's doing the activity in particular, right? So the answer is, well, it's both. It's God and the Thessalonians. And he even uses the dark versions of it, where in Ephesians, he talks about the children of wrath are energized by the devil. So Paul uses this concept in a variety of contexts. And when we look at when we compare Paul with St. Peter, one of the things that we find is that when Peter says that we escape the corruption that has come upon the world by partaking of the divine nature. And we ask, well, what does that mean? We find the answer in Paul. Because Paul, when he talks about, for example, in 1 Corinthians 15, he starts to talk about the nature of resurrection. He talks about it as the putting off of corruption. And it's the putting off of corruption for what? Well, the putting on of incorruption. Well, that raises an odd question. Incorruption, immortality, these sorts of things, like how do we put these on? And it's interesting to note that St. Paul is really clear that God alone is immortal. And so it's interesting that on the one hand, if you look at this is one of the things that first clued me into this feature of the New Testament. And I started to tap into it long before I became Orthodox. It's one of the reasons I resonated when I discovered it in the Eastern Fathers. On the one hand, in the New Testament, St. Paul will say things like God alone is immortal. And on the other hand, the New Testament promises us immortality. And the question would be, well, how do you put those two things together? And I think what you find is that the answer is really exactly what we talked about here with synergy. The idea being that yes, incorruption or immortality is something that is unique to God. It's unique to the divine nature. But it is an energy of God. It is an operative power of God. And so the promise of incorruption, the promise of immortality, the promise of metamorphosis in the resurrection from the dead is not the promise of a divine magic trick where God's just going to snap his fingers and voila, right? You are raised from the dead and cease to be subject to death and dying. But rather, it is something that happens by partaking of the divine nature. As St. Peter says, you start to participate in the operative powers of God. You start to participate in God's own immortality and incorruption. That is the promise of the gospel. And you begin to see this in things like when Christ talks to folks about, he says that, the Father is life in himself. He's given it to me to have life in myself, but you won't come to me in order to have life. Again, the life being promised to us in the gospel is the life of God. The immortality promised to us in the gospel is God's own immortality. The promise of incorruption and the resurrection from the dead is a promise of partaking of God's own incorruption. And this is something that you see in the Eastern Church Fathers. It's central to how they understand the promise of the gospel, is that what man is as an icon of God is something that is made to partake of the divine nature. And this goes back to certain aspects of the way ancient figures thought about images in general. So it's interesting that when you look at somebody like Plato, Plato talks about the fact that there are two different types of images. There are non-substantial images and there are substantial images. Something like a shadow is a non-substantial image. Why? Well, because it's a negation. It's just an absence of light. It's not a substantial reality. So it's a negative reality, not a positive one. But he recognizes that there are positive substantial images. Now, the thing that raises for Plato is the question of, well, what is the nature of an image? And if you know anything about Plato, because he's particularly interested in things like the forms, that question makes sense because the forms are definitions of things, right? The form of a square, you start to talk about, 4 right angles and 4 sides and all of that. And so when asking the question of like, what is it, which is the sort of quintessential Platonic question about a form, and he begins to ask that about images, he finds something rather fascinating about the nature of images. Images are inherently referential, meaning when you begin to talk about an image, you start to talk about it as an image of, right? And you have to fill in the blank. It's an image of what? And so what Plato found fascinating about images is the idea that an image is something whose definition actually refers to something else, something extrinsic to itself. It has to refer to something outside of itself. And while we might expect that, well, perhaps this is sort of unique to Plato, this is actually reflected in so much of the Old Testament language about images. So yes, on the one hand, we're very attuned to the Old Testament talk of idols, but there's also quite a bit of talk in the Old Testament about images. And those are two different words, right? Idolos versus homoioma. You have the two different words, right? The one being idol and the other being an image. And you find this, one of the things that's very fascinating in the Old Testament that sort of resonates and echoes this point about Plato, where the second commandment, right, the prohibition on idols, is exposited. And what's interesting in that passage is that you get the rationale for it. And this is, incidentally, I have to just sort of do a quick aside here as somebody who is Eastern Orthodox, in honor of people like John of Damascus and so on. Clearly, the Old Testament doesn't prohibit images, right? Because God, giving the commandments, where you have a prohibition in the second commandment on making images of God, it goes on and it tells you to make a bunch of images for the tabernacle, right? Things in heaven and things on earth, things like pomegranates, things like angels, and so on. So it's clearly not a prohibition on images, but on images of God, right? That's the worry. And in Deuteronomy, you actually get God expositing the commandment and explaining the rationale. And what's interesting is what it says over and over again, is it says, because when I spoke to you from the mountain, you heard a voice and you saw no likeness, homoioma, right? This idea of a likeness. And then as the passage continues, what that is paired with is all of these references to not making likenesses of things that crawl on the earth, or things that are winged, or things that are this, or things that are that. And what becomes clear in the passage when you look at this is that it points out that if you make an image of this thing, then you will be worshiping that thing. That's its image. But your God doesn't have an image because you heard a voice and you saw nothing. Right? So if you make an image of a lizard, you won't be worshiping your God, even if you call it your God. You'll be worshiping lizards. Why? Because the lizard is the one to whom that image belongs. Now, this is fascinating because what it actually indicates, it indicates that the real worry with regard to images, with regard to idols, is not that images per se are bad, right? As I said, the tabernacle includes all sorts of images that are actually commanded to be there by God. But the worry is that your God is not a reptile. Your God is not a cow. And so if you make the image of a cow, you'll actually be worshiping the cow and not your God, right? That there's a connection between the image and the archetype of the thing. And this is, of course, why you get the brilliant icon of God, which is the Ark of the Covenant, where you make images of things around God, right? The angels that won't look at God. So you know that, that's the seat, right? That's where he is. It's a way of making an image of something invisible by making the image of the things around it. It's brilliant. But the point here is to say this, that one of this understanding in the ancient world that there's a connection between images and archetypes was important because it also presumed that one of the things about images is they display or are susceptible to the attributes of their archetype. In other words, that when you begin to make the image of the thing, right, the image in some ways shares in the attributes. That's how it images it. It shares in the attributes of the thing that it images. And this goes straight to the nature of man, that we as images of God are beings who, on the one hand, we share certain divine attributes, attributes of reason, attributes of free will, spiritual attributes. And yet, at the same time, there is this likeness. There are activities or energies or operations that we are made to imitate. We are made to be just and merciful and loving, right? We are made to bear the fruit of the Spirit. But also with this, we're also made to attain immortality, incorruptibility, and these other sorts of divine attributes. So that's central to the nature and the destiny of man, that man as an image of God is made as a being who shares in divine attributes and is susceptible to sharing in other divine attributes. A plant can't imitate divine justice or mercy or love or something like that. Only a higher being who bears the image of God is capable of bearing that likeness, that active imitation. And so that is part of what it is, and when you talk about the nature of man and the destiny of man, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about innate nature, a rational nature that shares in certain divine attributes. And because of those shared attributes, those capacities of reason and free will, the spiritual nature that we have, that makes it possible for us to actively imitate God and to bear his likeness as well, to participate in attributes that are activities or energies. And so this is how the Eastern Fathers, drawing on the New Testament, end up understanding the Christian hope, right? What the nature of man is that you are an image of God. What the destiny of man is that you are to bear God's likeness. And what that means is that you are destined for deification, for being made God, right? In this way, partaking of the divine nature, and in this way, becoming a small mirror of divinity. That's the destiny of man. So that's our first point. Now, I had said that we needed to also look at the nature of creation. And this is where I think so often, definitely in Western Christianity, there's a tendency to think of man and the destiny of man in a way that's disconnected from the rest of creation, as if salvation is really just sort of about me, and creation itself is just kind of a maze that you run through, hoping that you come out on the side of heaven rather than hell, or something like that. But when you look at the vision of creation that you find in the Eastern Church Fathers, you get a very different picture of the nature of the world. I've talked before about the idea of the great chain of being, right? This idea that what the world is a sort of hierarchy of perfections, various perfections that somehow articulate or express God. And so, and I think this is critical to begin to understand the sort of different sort of way of approaching the world. The great chain of being philosophy was very common in the ancient world, and it's very common in Western Christianity as well. This part is not necessarily unique to the Eastern Church Fathers. The presumption was that God, being infinite perfection, then begins to express or articulate that perfection in tangible ways. So this is, if we're going to use the essence energies distinction as a way of articulating this concept, we might think of it this way. Let's imagine that we have a composer, right? A brilliant composer. We'll call him Bach. And when we look at Bach, we say like, oh, I'm introducing you to Bach, and I say he is a creative genius, right? He is an absolute wellspring of the highest form of musicality and creativity that you could possibly hope for. Now, you recognize that those words that I'm saying are very high and lofty. I'm giving him very high praise. But what that actually means for you is completely intangible. And the reason is because you can't sort of open up Bach's chest and look inside and say, I see the wellspring of creativity. It's inaccessible to you, right? It's sitting there beyond the veil, as it were, of what you have access to. But the fact of the matter is that Bach has a way of expressing or articulating that in a way that is accessible to you. How? He composes something, or he plays something. And this is an excellent picture of the distinction between the essence and the energies of a thing. That on the one hand, the nature of a thing is what sort of sits back there behind the veil, unarticulated, inaccessible, but then begins to manifest and articulate itself in very particular forms. In the case of Bach, his creativity begins to articulate or express itself in various compositions. But the fact of the matter is, there is no one composition that encompasses the whole of his creativity, because Bach could begin to compose one type of piece of music here and then another type over there. And these would all have sort of different parameters, right? Some might be slow and contemplative. Some might be intricate and fast. Others might be operatic. Some might be, whatever it may be. And here, forgive me if, this terminology is not technically sound in terms of musicality. I'm not a musician. But you get the idea that, that not every creative act encompasses the whole of his creativity. That really, if you wanted to understand the creativity of Bach, you would have to study the whole of his musical corpus, so to speak. And every piece of music, every stage of it, every new composition would tell you something new and unique and different about it. And all of those finite pieces would begin to form for you a concept of the creative wellspring that sits behind it. And we could do the same thing with, with drawing and painting, talking about different artists or whatever it might be, or philosophers or whatever it might be, right? You get the idea that there's a certain nature, whether we're talking about a philosophical nature that comes out in certain articulations of, written treatises or essays or whatever else, or if we're talking about an artist with a creative wellspring of drawing and painting that comes out in particular pieces of art, or we're talking about musicians or whatever it is. Well, so in the same way, God is this infinite divine nature. And the divine nature, on the one hand, is ontologically full and robust and all the rest. But by itself, that's a mere abstraction, right? It's something that's highly intangible and inaccessible to us. In fact, this is how people like Philo of Alexandria interpret the distinction between God's face and his back, right? His face that you can't look upon is that infinite abyss of divinity. But the back is where God begins to articulate himself in specific actions. So I talked about the fact that God expresses himself freely in acts of justice or in acts of creation or acts of mercy or acts of love or in miracles or whatever it may be. And that's true, just like with Bach. This is an expression or articulation of the divine nature. It begins to form for us a concept of who and what God is. Now, the concept of the great chain of being is that creation itself is that very type of expression. That one of the reasons why, when you look at creation, you begin to see a variety of things is because all of these, just like with Bach, where each composition tells you something new and unique about the wellspring of creativity, so in the same way, all of the different perfections of creation, all of the different dynamics of creation tell you something new about the divine nature. A single creature couldn't do that. Even if God makes an angel, that would only tell you so much about the divine nature. It would tell you something about the divine nature, but plants tell you something different. Rocks tell you something different. And what's interesting is that when you look at creation and you look across the genera and species, you not only see a variety of, species of things, but you see a variety of combinations of intelligible properties, right? Some things are winged, other things are not. Some things are bipedal, some things are quadrupedal. And you start to see that there are various combinations of all these different articulations, because it's not just the single property that articulates something about God, but the various combinations of the properties begin to articulate something about God. And so the great chain of being was this concept that what you begin to see in the hierarchy of reality is you see this articulation of divine perfection, of divine wisdom, of divine goodness in all the different varieties of being that stretch from the most humble of creatures to the most godlike of creatures and all the various combinations in between. And this really is sort of the orchestral vision of creation. Again, to use a musical analogy, if we were trying to understand something about the musical nature of Bach, and I said, okay, well, I want you to understand something about his creative genius. And I handed Bach a triangle, right? Metal triangle. Well, you couldn't learn too much about Bach's creative genius from that triangle. You could learn something, and you might be very impressed. He might do, I would presume he would do something with it much more than you or I could possibly conceive of, and we might be blown away and very impressed. But the fact of the matter is that triangle has certain innate limitations to it. There's only so much that he can do. And then maybe if we gave him like a ukulele or something like that, he could do more, right? And now we get to understand a new dynamic of it. And we begin to see more of that creative genius. But then, of course, if we give him like a cello or we give him a piano, we're going to start to see new dynamics. Now, what's interesting is, on the one hand, we could start to just treat that as a hierarchy, like it's just that cello is superior to triangle. And it may be very well superior to triangle as an instrument in a variety of ways. But the fact of the matter is the cello, too, has innate limitations. There are things about it that Bach might express himself through a timpani that can't be expressed through the cello. And this is really sort of getting you to the orchestral vision. That on the one hand, yes, Bach can do more with a cello than he can with a triangle. But if you give him an orchestra where we get to have the piano and the cello and the strings and the horns and the timpani and the triangle, right? Now what we begin to see is we begin to see all of the different dynamics of Bach's musicality come into a cohesive harmony that's beyond any one of them. And this is the vision of the holistic, picture of if we're applying the analogy of creation, that creation itself really is the orchestral vision of God. That yes, perhaps a plant or a rock, let's say a rock, is sort of the triangle of ontology, and perhaps something like an angel is the piano of ontology. But the fact of the matter is that all of the different varieties of creation, from rocks to plants to animals to man to angels, they all tell us something different about God. And when they're brought together in a cohesive, harmonious whole, we begin to get a more robust orchestral picture of the nature of God, of the varieties of divine wisdom and goodness and justice and love and perfection, all those sorts of things. So that's really sort of the vision of what creation is. Now, the reason this is important is because when looking at creation, the vision is that every aspect of creation, every creature within the cosmos is made not only to articulate something of God, but to participate in God as much as possible, right? Now, the as much as possible is the key part. Notice that I said before that that the triangle has innate limitations, right? A triangle is not a cello, and a cello is not a ukulele, right? They all have their sort of innate natures, which also come with innate limitations. Now, those limitations are perfectly suitable to what they are. This is actually the difference between what in the scholastics would call the difference between negatio and privatio, right? So privatio is a corruption of a suitable perfection. So if my eye loses the capacity to see, that is a privation or a corruption, right? It's something where there's a certain perfection or power that my eye should have if it's properly formed, the power of sight. But my ear lacks the power of sight, and that's not a strike against it, right? Because it's an ear, it's not an eye. So in the one hand, right, the corruption of an eye is called privation, privatio. On the other hand, the absence of sight in the ear is just negatio. It's just that it doesn't have that, but that's okay because it's not an eye, right? Ears are not supposed to see. That's a suitable absence. So the creation is filled with suitable absences, right? Every creature has certain positive attributes, and then it lacks other perfections, and that's part of what gets you the variety of creation. But that suitable absence, that negation, it also sets up certain limitations of the creature's ability to participate in God. So again, hearkening back to Bach, the triangle can participate in Bach, but only to a certain degree because of those innate limitations. The ukulele can participate in Bach, but only to, a certain degree because of its suitable limitations. However, the presumption here is that in the orchestral vision, that when those instruments are brought together as a whole, now what you begin to get is an opportunity for things to participate in God to a degree that they couldn't otherwise do alone. So the triangle, no matter what Bach does with it, no matter how impressed we are with what he can do with a triangle, is still inherently extremely limited in terms of its ability to form a melody, for example. However, when it becomes part of an orchestra, now the triangle is elevated above its innate limitations because it is part of a larger whole. And as part of that larger whole, it begins to participate in Bach and his creativity in a much greater form, because now it is part of a unified orchestra with all of the different varieties of perfections. And this is a critical feature of great chain of being thinking, the idea that all of creation is made to participate in God as much as possible. And that as much as possible is the critical feature. The idea that God wishes plants to participate in him more than they could on their own. And this brings us to another doctrine within the Eastern Church Fathers where we see these things converge, right? These ideas of the nature and destiny of man converge with the nature, the orchestral vision of creation. And that's the doctrine that man is a microcosm of all that God has made. So you'll notice that in the Genesis creation account, God, he makes animals, right? He makes these things of earth, and then there are things of heaven, right? There are these celestial things and these earthly things. And one of the things that you see within in this vision is that you really see something that is common throughout the ancient world. Within the ancient world, there's a recognition that there are sort of two features of reality. This is something that Plato and Socrates are really big on. But you also see it there in the Genesis creation account and in the sort of Hebraic understanding of the world that then becomes integral to the Christian understanding of the world, which is that there's the realm of material flux, the realm of becoming, of change, of organic growth and diminishment on the one hand. And then there's the realm of these sort of relatively immortal things. I say relatively immortal because in Christian thinking, God alone is the only true immortal. God alone is the only true immaterial being, the only true, incorruptible being, and so on. But at least in terms of creation, there's this recognition that there is this sort of relative immortality. Angels don't sort of gestate and grow and then deteriorate and die. They don't age the way organisms do. And so you have these sort of two different types, these two different features of the things that God's made, the relatively immortal and the mortal realm, the things of change and flux and growth and decay versus the things that just sort of endure. So this is the sort of thing that, folks like Plato recognize, and which is echoed in things like the Genesis account, which is that reality really consists of two types of things. There's the realm of the sort of organic, where things sort of come into being and they grow and then they mature and then they start to erode and decay and die. That's the realm of, let's call it becoming. That's what Plato and Aristotle, what Plato calls it. Socrates and Plato call it. And then there's the realm of being, right? Which is the realm of the stable, the realm of the sort of relatively immortal, right? Angels, for example, don't gestate and grow and then get old and decay and die and things like that. So you have this sort of realm of being and the realm of becoming, the realm of the changing and the fluctuating and the realm of the relatively immortal. I say relatively because God alone is truly immortal. But then what you find in the Genesis creation account is you find that God at some point, after creating things in heaven and things on earth, he then makes man, which is taken from the dust of the earth, just like the beasts of the field, but then breathed into from heaven. And so in the story, what you get is you get the merger of the two types of things. And this really becomes integral to how human anthropology is understood, that we are on the one hand an animal, right? We have an animal nature, something that we share with the organic realm. And yet on the other hand, we also have this icon of God, right? This spiritual side, rational, free, and made to partake of the divine nature. Now, one of the questions we might ask is why? Why is it that God would make a microcosm? Why create this sort of bridge between the heavens and the earth? And here, the answer is tied intimately with the desire of God to see all things participate in God as much as possible. So a critical feature of how the Eastern Fathers understand the world is not just the idea of deification and divine energies and synergy, but also the concept of mediation. Now here, I have to sort of dispel a very Western tendency that we have. We tend to use the term mediator as a term that indicates to stand between two people. Like, don't talk to me, talk to my lawyer, right? It's a way of distancing me from you if I create a mediator between you and me. Whereas in the ancient world, amongst the Greeks, when you find the language of mediator, especially in the Eastern Church Fathers, the language of mediator actually means one who bridges or brings near. So let's think about it this way. We use the analogy of a branding iron to talk about the concept of synergy. The idea that the iron, the branding iron, the iron participates in the nature of fire. And through that participation, the energies of fire begin to be resident within it. They take up residence within it. And then that branding iron carries the energies of fire over to the cow. Now, here's the question. To the cow, how distant does that fire feel? Well, the answer is not very distant. It's burning it. Literally, it's burning it. And when we ask the question, well, who's burning the cow? Is it the iron or the fire? The answer is really both. The operative powers that supply the ability to burn belong to the fire. It's just that they are carried near to the cow by the branding iron. And this is the concept of mediation within the Eastern Church Fathers, the idea that a mediator is one who brings near, who bridges, who connects, as opposed to one who stands in between. So, for example, when St. Paul says that Christ is the one mediator between God and man, what Chrysostom understands this to mean is that Christ is the one person who in his nature, in his person, unifies the natures of divinity and humanity, because he is the God-man, right? He is the incarnate Son of God. So he's the Son of God, divine, and he takes on humanity. And in that, in his person, he brings those two things near. He unifies them. He bridges them, right? This is why he's the one mediator. That's what that term means in that context, between God and man. Now, this concept of mediation is critical. If we understand that what it is that, something is carried near, that it's bridged, that it's brought close, what we begin to see how the Eastern Fathers understand the vision for the cosmos prior to the fall. So let's imagine for a minute that the world does not fall into sin. Creatures do not rebel. No rational beings turn away from God, whether we're talking about angels or we're talking about man. All exercise their freedom and choose God, right? They turn toward God and they embrace their proper end. The icons of God, the rational beings, the icons of God, end up embracing God, and for that reason, they partake of the divine nature. Okay, what is the effect of that? And here, I think what we begin to see the orchestral vision of creation. It's not just that our world is sort of a harmonious set of beings that can coexist, but rather the vision for creation as laid bare, building on this doctrine of synergy, is the idea that all of creation is supposed to be energized by God. And here what we recognize is, of course, we have already this concept of deification that we've talked about, the idea that that man is meant to, as an image of God, bear God's likeness. And we're supposed to have the divine energies take up residence within us. We're not supposed to just bear the attributes of reason and free will, but we're supposed to actively imitate and participate in the attributes of God that are active, right? These active attributes of God. And the fact of the matter is, the Eastern Fathers understand the same thing to be true of the angels, right? So they'll talk about the angels who are also energized by God. They too, being spiritual beings who have reason and free will, are capable of partaking of the divine energies in a way very similar to the way man does. But here's what's interesting. Rather than considering these energies to only be resident in spirits, part of the concept of energia that we start to see in the Alexandrian Jews, then in the New Testament, then in the Eastern Fathers, is that other things can also partake in the divine nature through the icons of God. So one of the things that you'll notice if you start to look at the Old Testament and the New Testament is you begin to see that humans and angels are not the only things energized by God. You see, for example, instances where, say, the garments of Christ are somehow energized by God, such that if somebody touches them, power goes out from Christ. You see this in the Ark of the Covenant, right? Yes, on the one hand, you could look at this as, well, if you try to touch the Ark of the Covenant, you're struck dead because God's mad at you. Or alternatively, you can look at it the way this sort of more Alexandrian picture of, divine energies is that this is the mercy seat of God. It's been touched by God. It's been energized by God. And therefore, someone who touches it unworthily, they're going to negatively experience the divine energies. You begin to see this in things like Elisha's bones, right? So this saint, this very powerful saint who is energized by God when he's deceased, and his bones are there, and a dead man is cast onto those bones. The energies of God from that end up touching the dead man, and he's raised from the dead. In the book of Acts, certain people who couldn't get to the apostles, right? They're, what they would do is they would go to the apostles and they'd have somebody, touch the handkerchief, and then they'd bring that handkerchief to the sick person so that the sick person can touch it, and then they would be healed through touching that. And so what you start to see is that all throughout the Old Testament and then into the New Testament, that the divine energies oftentimes, to put it crudely, rub off. Right? That somehow that the participation in God, right, by some saint ends up being communicable to something that is not in fact an image of God. There's transference of a certain kind. And this is critical to how and why the Eastern Fathers understand God to have created man as a microcosm. Notice that in these stories, right, you see that people don't just go and pray and Jesus speaks a word and they're healed. Rather, he touches them or they touch him. His body itself becomes a conduit for the divine energy. You see similar sorts of things happen. Like I said, I use the example of Elisha's bones, where there's some sort of contact with a material sort of instrument here that becomes a vehicle for the divine energies. And so here, part of what the concept is, what the presumption was, is that because my lower nature, my animal nature, is unified with my spiritual nature, that unity ends up bridging the gap between those. In other words, an animal is not an icon of God, right? It tells you something about the divine perfection. It articulates something that's true about God, about God's wisdom and his goodness and things like that. But an animal is not capable of participating in the image and likeness of God the way a man is. And yet, if you make a being who is a rational animal, then the spirit, right, the rational spirit that is an icon of God, is able to mediate the divine energies to that animal nature because they're unified in one person. And this is critical, right? The idea here is that man as a microcosm is meant to be a bridge between God and the lower things of creation. The purpose of making a microcosm is to take the image of God and put it into the organic realm so that the realm of organism, realm of animal, can begin to partake of the divine nature in a way that it otherwise couldn't. So when you look at the vision for creation, the idea is not just that you have angels and man who are somehow deified, but rather the idea is that man, in being deified, man in partaking of the divine nature, begins to communicate that divine operative power, that divine energy to his own flesh, right, to his material nature, just like with Christ, right? When you look at this in the person of Christ, you begin to see that he is transfigured. His flesh glows, right? And ultimately in the resurrection, that is the promise, right? Paul talks about being buried one way and raised another way. The idea of being, sort of buried with one type of glory and raised in another type of glory and that sort of thing, putting off corruption for incorruption. The idea is it's a promise of metamorphosis, of transformation, where the flesh is meant to partake of the divine nature. How? Through the spirit, right? That the spirit somehow elevates the flesh to which it is united. And in this way, the icon of God being put into an animal makes it possible for that material animal nature to partake in God in a way that it otherwise could not. That's the purpose of making a microcosm. And really the vision here is that man being taken from the dust of the earth. Part of the vision of what you find in the Genesis creation account is that there is a certain commonality across the material realm. There's a certain sense in which all comes from the earth, right? It's giving a certain common starting point for all things, that from the earth springs forth plants, that the animals are taken from the dust of the earth, and then man is taken from the dust of the earth, that there's a certain unity to the organic realm. And so by providing a mediator between God and the earth, which is the microcosm of man, you offer to creation a hope of partaking of God, partaking of the divine nature, of being elevated and participating in God in a way that it otherwise could not. And in this sense, the vision, the real vision of creation, is that orchestral vision, where it's not just that all of creation is part of a sort of wise schematic that just shows you how wise God is, but rather the vision is that all of these different beings, from the highest to the lowest, have an opportunity to partake of the divine nature. But in the case of the lower things that are not images of God, animals and plants, their hope of partaking of the divine nature is the bridge between them and God, which is man. That's the purpose of the man, the microcosm, who unifies heaven and earth in one subject. So if we were to play this out, let's pretend for a moment that the fall never happened. What you would begin to see is you would begin to see a cascading participation in God, where you have God, and from God radiates the divine energies, right? The divine attributes that are participated in by the angels, the highest order of angels, and cascade down to the lower order of angels, and ultimately to man, but also from man to animals and plants and to the rest of creation, such that all of the world is transfigured and ablaze with divine glory, that all things partake of the divine nature and end up participating in God to the degree they are able, a degree that is actually elevated through the microcosm, which is man. Now, this actually goes to one further aside that I want to touch on before I actually get into the groaning of creation. I've made the point in some other podcasts, as well as in my Substack, that there's something notable about what I think is the normative nature of providence. Due to the influence of modernity, we have a tendency to think of the divine will and divine activity as if it is somehow the ghost within the machine, like that you and I and the cosmos is just sort of, we're machinery, right? That's what the creation is, this giant clockwork. And then if God is to show up, right, he's going to show up as some sort of invisible presence, sort of tinkering with the machine. He's the ghost within the machine. But when you start to have this concept of synergy, right, this idea of participation, and you begin to think of the world more like this porous entity, right, that you and I and all of creation are porous, right? We see this in the organic realm. Certainly, we take into ourselves, food and air, right, and water, and that becomes part of us. And we expel things that become part of the world around us. We're open systems. We're porous. And you begin to recognize that porous nature extends to the spiritual realm as well. What you begin to see is you begin to see how God might be at work and operative within the machine in a more direct way, because he's not sort of invading machinery as a foreign entity. Rather, what you have is you have the machinery itself, and I hate to even use that, the organism itself is an open system. The organism itself is an open system that's spiritually porous, that's made to partake of spiritual energy, including the spiritual energy of God. Now, when you begin to look at the world in that way, and you begin to consider the nature of providence, I think there's a very interesting thought experiment to raise, which is to ask the question, how often in Scripture does God show up unmediated? What I mean, where God the Father, let's say, shows up without any sort of mediation, no sort of angel, no sort of material elements, no sort of prophet, no, nothing like that. And the answer is that's an exceedingly rare incident. Yes, you do have these incidents, right, where the divine energies show up, the divine glory or something like that. But more often than not, what you begin to see is you see that God operates in and through something, right? He operates in and through a prophet, or in and through an angel, or in and through an energized element of creation. What you see is that the normative mode of providence seems to be that God operates in and through the workings of the existing machinery, that he energizes something within the organism. But let's just say for a moment, that we were desperate, to hear from God. And we happen to live in the days of Moses or something like that. And Moses began to talk to us. And let's say that Moses didn't just begin to talk to us. Let's say he had recently been on Mount Sinai and he came down and his face was glowing with divine energy, as happened in one of these instances. Would we be sitting there and saying, "Where's God?" And the answer would be no, right? There would be a palpable presence of God. We'd be acutely aware of the presence of God and probably a little bit freaked out about it, as the people around Moses were, which is why he put on a veil, because we'd recognize that we are seeing the energies or the glory of God radiating from Moses's face. We recognize that that's not normal, right? People don't typically walk around with that. Now, truthfully, if the world wasn't fallen and, reality was the way it was supposed to be, where all things are energized by God, that would be the normative state of things. It's that we live in an abnormal state where we're not accustomed to that people are freaked out because that seems abnormal, even though we're in the abnormal state. But suffice it to say, if you and I were sitting around and going, "Where is God?" and then Moses approached us and his face was aglow with divine glory, we wouldn't be wondering, yeah, but where is God really? We would recognize that there is a very real and palpable presence of God there within Moses, that Moses is somehow mediating the presence of God to us. And when we recognize this, what we start to see is we start to catch a glimpse of what the order of nature properly is supposed to be. That God is everywhere present and filling all things in a way that is exceedingly palpable. That we would never look around. If everybody in creation was partaking of the divine nature the way the flesh of Christ exudes the divine nature in the transfiguration, or the way the face of Moses was exuding the divine glory, coming down from Sinai, we would never look around and go, "Yeah, but where is God?" Because we'd recognize his divine glory everywhere. We would see it radiating out of all the creatures that he animates and glorifies, that all of the things that are partaking of God would convey to us the divine glory, and we'd recognize his presence everywhere. Now, the reason this is significant is because that really is the picture of creation as it's made to be. Angels ablaze with divine glory, man ablaze with divine glory, and then through man, the lower things of creation as well. Not just the flesh and blood of man, but also the animals, the plants, the whole of creation. Part of the significance of this is that it really sort of highlights the significance of the fall, really. Because if the normative mode of providence, if the nature of the creation is such, the way the organism is set up, the cosmic organism is set up, is that you and I are porous, rational beings are porous, and we are made to be the mediators, the ones who carry the presence of God into the world. We carry the presence and the glory of God to one another and to the lower things of nature. What that also means is that we, as those designated mediators, when we decide to turn away from God, we shut off part of the valve between God and world, as it were. We cease to mediate that presence of God to the lower things of creation or to one another. And so oftentimes when we're wondering, where is God? Why is God so hidden? The answer to that question is oftentimes just in the mirror. Right? The reason that God's presence, his love, his mercy, his wisdom, his goodness, his kindness, and things like that are not manifesting is because we are refusing to manifest them. We are refusing to participate. We are refusing to engage in the synergistic acts that we are created to engage in as images of God. And this really is sort of what you see in the fall, right? The vision of the fall is that ultimately the reason creation begins to die is because that bridge that is meant to be the mediator, right? The one who carries to the lower things of creation the glory of God, the immortality of God, the attributes of God, the likeness of God to the lower things of nature, has turned away from God. And in this sense, embraced death and dying. And this really is how the Eastern Fathers understand the nature of the fall of man. So one of the things that begins to be asked early on, it's asked initially, you can see it in Alexandrian Jews like Philo, and then you can see it in the church fathers very early on, people very early like Theophilus of Antioch, is the question of if Adam is really sort of composed of two types of things, right? He's composed of the mortal things of nature, and he's composed of the immortal things of nature. Then is he mortal or is he immortal? And how that riddle, so to speak, how that puzzle is solved, initially by Philo and then echoed by the church fathers, is the idea that Adam's will serves as the fulcrum of a balanced scale. And the question is, how is his nature going to be ordered, right? Will his higher nature, his spiritual nature, that image of God, take the reins and order the lower nature, be in control and elevate it by carrying to it the nature of God? Or will he subjugate that higher nature to the lower nature and make it subordinate to his animal, mortal nature? And obviously we know which one he chose. And this is actually how they understand the nature of the fall, that what happened in the fall is an inversion of human nature, that what you and I are made to experience, we as icons of God are made to mediate to our lower nature the divine attributes and elevate it and allow it, bring it into communion with God, exactly as I talked about. And yet, rather than doing that in the fall, what happens is that higher nature is subjugated to the lower nature. And all of a sudden, it's bound by the passions. And rather than being able to carry and participate, carry the divine attributes down, and rather than being able to mediate the divine energies to the lower nature, it ends up being subjugated to the lower nature and bound by death and by dying. And that's the human condition. And incidentally, this is what sets the context for the groaning of all creation. Well, why does it groan? Well, because the only hope for the lower things of creation, for the things of the earth, the only hope for plants and animals and things like that, of participating in God, of partaking of the divine nature, was us. And so when we invert our nature and we cut them off from God, when the mediator that is supposed to bring the divine energies down to the lower things of creation turns away from God, we end up cutting off that bridge and cutting off that hope. And that's the condition of death and dying in which not only we find ourselves in, but it's also the condition in which the rest of the creation is bound because of our fall, right? The cutting off of that tether to God. And this is what sets the context for the Eastern patristic understanding of the incarnation and of salvation. It's interesting that for the Eastern Church Fathers, when they talk about the redemption of humanity, yes, of course, they obviously talk about the crucifixion and they talk about the resurrection. But really, if you read Athanasius on the incarnation, the redemption of humanity really begins with Christmas. It really begins with the incarnation. And why? It's because what happens is the Son of God, the one who is of the same nature of the Father, who bears within his person the divine nature and all of the divine energies, reaches down and becomes a creature. He becomes one of us. And in this way, he rebuilds that bridge between the divine nature and humanity. He rebuilds that bridge that we cut off and tore down in the fall of man. And the vision of what happens in the incarnation is that Christ begins to restore and to heal our fallen human nature from within. He takes on the cancerous organ and he heals it by uniting it with his divine nature. That's the restoration that happens in the incarnation. And the rest of his life, right? The rest of his life and ultimately his death and his resurrection and all of that is the completion of the healing process of humanity. But that healing first is initiated and begins by the very fact of his incarnation. That's what rebuilds the bridge and begins the healing of our species. The reason I think that's important is because I think that is the thing that all of creation recognizes as significant. I had mentioned that beneath all of the nostalgia and all the childhood memories and all of the family traditions and those sorts of things, that there's something deeper that sits underneath all of that. And it is this sense that the cosmos itself knows something significant is happening, or more accurately, something significant has happened. And I think what you're really sensing, what I'm sensing, if you can tap into that, what you're experiencing is you're experiencing that longing of a fallen creation, a creation that knows that humanity was its hope of partaking in the divine nature. That in the fall, that hope was dashed because the mediator between the divine nature and itself broke ties with its creator. And yet, at Christmas, what happens is the creator himself becomes a creature. And by uniting himself with his creation, becoming one of us, he rebuilds that bridge. And the healing of our species, the healing of that bridge, the restoration of that bridge, the mediation of the divine nature back to the lower things of creation is rebuilt. And through that, our species is healed. And what we're invited into through baptism, chrismation, repentance, confession, the Eucharist, what we're invited into is a participation in that healing, what C.S. Lewis called a good infection, right? The idea that what happens when you are sick, right? You have this infection or you have some sort of wound or something like that. It's an infection that starts at one point and it begins to spread, right? That's the picture that C.S. Lewis uses to talk about this very concept in Mere Christianity. The idea that what happens in the incarnation is that there's a good infection, the dying cancerous creation that longs for healing and for life, that aches for its restoration and the rebuilding of its bridge back to God, the restoration of its hope. What happens is a good infection happens. The creator invades the creation, taking on human nature and healing it and rebuilding that bridge. And that when you and I enter into the church, when we're baptized into Christ and we're chrismated and filled with the Holy Spirit, and we partake of his body and blood and we are restored and we begin to participate in that healing ourselves, that good infection begins to spread throughout the world. And it's made to spread throughout the entire cosmos from now until the culmination of all things. And I think the cosmos, being one giant divine organism that is made to partake of God, it intuitively understands this at some level. It longs for it and it aches for it. Plants may not be able to articulate or understand conceptually that, but there's still within the life of all of the cosmos an ache or a longing for the thing for which it is made, for its God, right? To partake of the divine nature at a degree that goes beyond what it otherwise can. And all of creation feels the breaking of that bridge. And so in the same way, in the incarnation, that hope, that restoration, that healing is what begins to percolate and break out. And I think that is the thing that all of creation feels. That when this time of year rolls around, you're not just missing some family tradition. You're not just nostalgic for certain types of action figures you used to look forward to getting at Christmas time. It's not just a looking back to a time that was more innocent. Instead, what you're really experiencing is you as a member of a cosmos that longs and aches for participation in God, that has at a deep ontological level an understanding, a longing to be something more than it is, recognizes that this is the time of year when we remember that healing that began when the creator became a creature and began that good infection that currently spreads throughout the world. And every time this time of year rolls around, it begins to remember that, and it begins to anticipate and long for the restoration of all things, the time when finally, at long last, all of creation will partake of the divine nature in the way and to the degree it was made to from the start. That's what the incarnation is all about. And that is what I think this time of year we can all sense, the cosmic anticipation of the future celebration. Merry Christmas, everybody. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.
The Christian East and the Christian West share the same creed, the same scriptures, and yet they are worlds apart. The differences run deeper than Mary or icons or liturgy, going to the very nature of God, the hope of salvation, and even what it means to be human. They use the same words, but their meanings could not be more different. As these two worlds collide in our contemporary culture, what's needed is a translator. I spent nearly 2 decades studying these two traditions, devoting myself to figures like Augustine, Aquinas, and the Reformers in the West, but finding myself crossing the threshold of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And now, I'm producing a 25-part lecture series to help bridge this gap, exploring the differences between Eastern and Western Christianity. Pre-order the series now at the lowest price that will ever be offered, or support my efforts by becoming a series producer at theeastwestseries.com. That's theeastwestseries.com.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.